In the shadows of Denver International Airport, where millions of passengers pass through each day without a second glance, an invisible man watches every movement. Thomas "Tank" Morrison, 68, carries more than just the filthy rags draped over his aging body. He carries secrets that could shake the foundations of national security. His calloused hands tremble slightly as he grips a cup of cold coffee, not from the chill of the winter morning, but from memories that refuse to die. No one would ever guess that this seemingly broken veteran was once one of the deadliest weapons the United States ever created. But fate is about to drag him out of the shadows in a way no one could have predicted. For 3 long years, Thomas made his home in the West Terminal, a ghost among the living who knows every corner, every emergency exit, every blind spot in the security system. The guards tolerate him only because he never causes trouble, always keeps his area clean, and steps aside when asked. Rushed passengers pass him by as if he were part of the furniture, their faces betraying a mix of pity and discomfort. What they don't know is that every glance he casts is not from a lost man, but from a trained soldier whose threat radar never truly shut down. His scars tell stories of battles in distant lands, but the greatest war he fights is against the ghosts of a past that officially never existed. The cruel irony of his current situation doesn't escape Thomas. A man who once protected the nation now relies on its charity to survive. Each coin tossed into his cup is a silent reminder of how heroes are forgotten once their wars are over. He's learned to be invisible out of necessity, but also by choice, knowing that sometimes the best protection is not being seen. The other homeless people who drift through the airport respect him, not just for his age, but for something intangible in his eyes, an intensity that suggests dangerous depths. They call him Tank not just for his still imposing physique, but because they sense he could withstand anything life throws at him. As the sun rises over the ice-covered runways, casting long shadows across the terminal windows, Thomas has no idea this will be the day everything changes. People around him begin their morning routines, lugging suitcases, checking flight times, hugging loved ones, mundane actions that will soon spiral into absolute terror. His right hand instinctively touches a medal hidden beneath his tattered shirt, a habit he developed whenever something feels off. The airport is filling with the usual morning bustle, but Thomas senses a tension in the air that others can't detect. Something is coming, and all his military instincts are screaming, even if his conscious mind hasn't yet figured out what's wrong. What Thomas Morrison didn't know was that while he watched the airport's morning rhythm, he himself was being watched. 3 men dressed as ordinary executives had arrived on the 6:47 a.m. flight, but their trained eyes swept the terminal with the precision of predators hunting prey. Their expensive suits and fine leather briefcases were the perfect camouflage to hide intentions dark enough to make anyone's worst nightmares seem like fairy tales. The group's leader, a Slavic-looking man with a nearly invisible scar on his left temple, gave a barely perceptible signal to his associates. Thomas, his instincts sharpened by decades of training, sensed the danger before he consciously identified its source. Something primal in his brain screamed that wolves had entered the flock. The tension in the air thickened like a gathering storm, but only Thomas seemed able to feel it. Passengers continued their routine, parents chasing toddlers, executives on calls, tourists checking maps, completely unaware that deadly predators walked among them. The veteran noted how the 3 men positioned themselves strategically near the main exits, a formation he recognized from tactical manuals he had studied decades ago. Their heart rates were too steady, their movements too calculated, and the way their eyes mapped out every security camera revealed a level of professionalism that made Thomas's blood run cold. These were no ordinary criminals. They were trained operatives. Whatever their plan was, it would be executed with military precision. Thomas forced himself to maintain the relaxed posture of a beggar, knowing that any shift in behavior could alert the intruders. His hands, seemingly busy sorting change in his cup, were in fact mentally tracking all possible escape routes and cataloguing every nearby object that could be used as an improvised weapon. The metal trash can 3 meters away, the abandoned wheelchair near the information desk, even the USB cable a teenage girl had dropped, all of it became part of a mental arsenal his soldier's mind automatically assembled. An invisible countdown had begun in his head, even though he didn't yet know what kind of explosion it was ticking toward. Decades of training don't vanish just because a man ends up on the street. They lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. It was approaching 8:30 a.m. when Thomas spotted the fourth man. He was different from the others, younger, nervous, with visible sweat on his forehead, despite the airport's icy air conditioning. He carried a backpack with far too much care, as if it held something both fragile and deadly. Thomas's heart pounded as his suspicions were confirmed. The young man discreetly checked a device on his wrist, then looked directly at the group's leader. A barely noticeable signal passed between them, and Thomas knew that whatever hell they had come to unleash was about to begin. He closed his eyes for a moment, whispering a silent prayer, not for his own safety, but for the innocent souls around him, unaware that their final moments of peace were about to end. When he opened his eyes again, the soldier inside him was fully awake, ready for a war no one else knew had already begun. At 8:32 a.m., hell quite literally descended upon Denver International Airport. The deafening crack of automatic gunfire echoed through the terminal like thunder in a deadly storm as screams of terror pierced the air that, moments before, had been filled only with morning anticipation. The leader of the group Thomas had been watching drew a submachine gun from his executive briefcase with the fluidity of a professional, and within seconds the terminal transformed from a travel hub into a war zone. Passengers dropped to the floor in absolute panic, some scrambling behind pillars and counters, others running blindly toward exits, only to find them already blocked by more terrorists. Thomas remained perfectly still in his position, every fiber of his military training analyzing the situation with the cold calculation of a predator, knowing that a single rushed move could cost innocent lives. "Everyone on the ground, now!" the leader shouted in heavily accented English, while his accomplices took up tactical positions around the main terminal. The nervous young man with the backpack ran toward the center of the concourse, barking orders in a language Thomas recognized as Russian, confirming his worst suspicions about the international nature of the operation. Roughly 200 people were now trapped in the terminal, instantly transformed from travelers into hostages, their lives now hanging on decisions that would unfold in the next few minutes. Children cried desperately in the arms of terrified parents. Executives who had been speaking confidently on their phones just moments before now trembled uncontrollably. Elderly travelers heading to visit distant family questioned whether they would live to see their loved ones again. Thomas took it all in from the corner of his eye, head lowered, but ears trained on every command, every footstep, every breath from the captors. The unmistakable sound of helicopters began to pulse from outside, and Thomas knew the authorities were responding. But he also knew hostage negotiations could take hours, hours that many of these innocent people might not have. His hands trembled not with fear, but with the familiar adrenaline that precedes combat, a sensation he hadn't felt in years, but one his body recognized instantly, like a dangerous old friend. Through the chaos of screams and shouted orders, he heard something that froze his blood, the desperate sobbing of a small child, a little girl, maybe 5 years old, who had been separated from her parents in the initial chaos. She was crouched behind a row of chairs, barely 10 meters from one of the terrorists, completely exposed and vulnerable, an easy target should the attackers choose to make an example of someone. In that moment, Thomas Morrison knew his time in the shadows was over. The leader began shouting demands in English, something about political prisoners and the release of frozen government assets, but Thomas wasn't listening anymore. His focus had narrowed into something laser-sharp, The terrified child, the exact distance to each assailant, the position of every possible piece of cover between him and the threats. Decades of training converged into one perfect moment of clarity. He had spent 3 years being invisible, and now he would use that invisibility as his greatest weapon. The terrorists didn't see him as a threat, just another terrified civilian, and that would be their fatal mistake. Thomas took a deep breath, touched the medal hidden beneath his ragged shirt one final time, and prepared to remind the world why some soldiers never really retire. War had come back for him, and he was ready to answer the call one last time. The moment of decision came when Thomas saw the terrorist closest to the child turn in his direction, his jittery finger tightening on the trigger. In a split second that stretched into eternity, the 68-year-old veteran became once again the lethal soldier he had once been, his muscles responding with a memory forged in fire that even decades on the streets hadn't erased. He moved with the silent speed of a ghost, using the chaos and screams to mask his approach, gliding between rows of chairs like a deadly shadow. The first terrorist didn't even register death's arrival until he felt Thomas's arm clamp around his neck, cutting off blood flow with surgical precision. His weapon became useless in seconds. The man's body collapsed to the ground without a sound, and Thomas caught the submachine gun before it could make any noise on impact. The second attacker noticed his partner's absence only when Thomas was already 2 meters away, but that half-second of hesitation was all the veteran needed. A disarming technique he had learned during classified missions in countries whose names never appeared in official reports, kicked in automatically. In one fluid motion, the weapon flew from the terrorist's hands straight into Thomas's. The soft thud of a fist striking the base of the man's skull echoed faintly above the chaos, and another attacker joined the first on the floor. The little girl, who had unknowingly sparked this heroic response, stared wide-eyed at the ragged man, who now moved like a vengeful ghost, unable to understand how the beggar she'd seen just minutes earlier had transformed into something straight out of an action movie. The third terrorist finally realized something had gone terribly wrong when he saw 2 of his comrades lying on the floor, and a homeless man wielding a submachine gun with the confidence of an elite operator. His eyes widened in shock and terror as Thomas emerged from the shadows like a force of nature, moving with a lethal fluidity that defied both his apparent age and his appearance as a vagrant. The terrorist tried to shout a warning to the leader, but Thomas was already upon him, delivering a devastating combination of hand-to-hand techniques that neutralized the threat before a single sound could leave the man's throat. The veteran had become a silent war machine, every movement calculated for maximum efficiency and minimal noise, saving lives while taking others with the cold precision of a professional. In a matter of minutes, 3 out of the 4 attackers had been taken down, and the terminal was now engulfed in a tense silence, broken only by the muffled sobs of terrified hostages. The group's leader, realizing his meticulously planned operation had been dismantled by a single man who should have remained invisible, began desperately scanning for the ghost who had destroyed his team. Thomas used the pillars and terminal structures as cover, moving with the patience of a seasoned hunter who knew that rushing could cost innocent lives. Every step was measured, every breath controlled, his eyes tracking not only his final target's location, but also ensuring that no civilians stood in the line of fire when the inevitable confrontation came. The nervous young man with the backpack had vanished in the chaos, but Thomas knew finding him would be his next priority. Whatever was inside that bag posed a threat far beyond the current hostage situation. The media had arrived in full force, news helicopters circling the airport while reporters positioned themselves behind police barricades, all scrambling to cover what had rapidly become the most shocking story of the year. Cell phone footage from passengers who had managed to escape was already streaming live across social media, showing blurry fragments of what appeared to be a homeless man neutralizing armed terrorists with his bare hands. Thomas emerged from the terminal carrying the small child in his arms, his dirty, bearded face a stark contrast to the surgical precision of his movements, an image that would become iconic within hours. Reporters shouted questions he completely ignored, his eyes scanning the crowd of first responders and authorities with an intensity that unsettled even seasoned officers, as if he were searching for something no one else could see. What disturbed officials the most was how Thomas refused medical attention, declined interviews, and showed no interest in any recognition for his extraordinary heroism. He handed the child off to paramedics, muttered a few words to the SWAT commander about the location of the neutralized attackers, and then simply tried to walk back into the shadows as if nothing had happened. But the world wasn't going to let him disappear again. Within an hour, hashtags like Ish Homeless Hero and Jeju Airport Angel were trending globally, and investigative reporters had already begun digging into his true identity. Thomas knew his days of invisibility were over. The discomfort in his eyes wasn't shyness. It was the awareness that being seen meant mortal danger, not just for him, but for anyone who discovered who he really was. The truth began to unravel when a CNN investigative reporter found military records that didn't add up. Thomas Morrison had been officially declared dead in an explosion in Baghdad in 2009, yet he was very much alive, saving hostages in Denver 15 years later. What the airport's security footage had captured wasn't just a brave veteran acting on instinct, but close-quarters combat techniques taught in only one place: the farm. The CIA's ultra-classified training facility located in Camp Peary, Virginia. Federal investigators who arrived for the debrief immediately recognized the disarming maneuvers and combat moves Thomas had used, unmistakable signatures of a program that officially didn't exist. The man the world believed to be a forgotten veteran living on the streets was, in fact, Agent 07, one of the most classified identities in American intelligence history. Thomas Morrison wasn't just a disgraced soldier lost after returning from war. He was a CIA operative who had faked his own death to escape a conspiracy within the very agency that once controlled him. For 2 decades, he had been the ghost that governments around the world feared, the man sent in when conventional operations failed and plausible deniability was the only option. His missions had saved millions, toppled dictators, prevented nuclear attacks, and dismantled terror networks across 6 continents. But when he discovered that some of his own handlers were selling American secrets to the highest bidder, he became a marked man. The explosion in Baghdad was real, but Thomas had orchestrated his own death to protect not just his life, but the secrets he carried. Secrets that, if revealed, could destabilize global alliances and cost countless innocent lives. Flashbacks began to flood Thomas's mind as he watched federal investigators arrive at the airport, faces he recognized, stirring memories he had buried deep for 15 years. He remembered the operation in Moscow, where he infiltrated a nuclear arms trafficking cell by posing as a diamond dealer for 6 months until he identified every member of the network. The mission in Caracas, where he stopped the assassination of a democratically elected president by neutralizing a team of French mercenaries using nothing but a kitchen knife and his lethal ingenuity. And most of all, he remembered the night in Istanbul when he discovered that his own handler, Deputy Director Marcus Webb, was selling lists of undercover American agents to the highest bidder, condemning dozens of loyal operatives to certain death. The decision to fake his own death had not been made lightly. Thomas knew that disappearing meant abandoning everything he loved, including Sarah, the CIA analyst he had secretly planned to marry after his final mission. But the alternative was being eliminated by his own agency, silenced before he could expose the corruption he had uncovered at the highest levels of government. So he orchestrated the explosion in Baghdad, using local contacts and a carefully measured charge of C4 to create a convincing death scene while escaping through tunnels he had mapped weeks in advance. The last 15 years living as a homeless man had been his self-imposed penance, a way to ensure the secrets he carried would die with him, protecting both innocent operatives and the fragile stability of the nation he had sworn to defend. Thomas's blood ran cold when he recognized the face of the nervous young man with the backpack in the airport security footage the feds were reviewing. It was Dmitry Volkov, the son of the arms dealer Thomas had eliminated during a covert mission in Chechnya in 2008. What had appeared to be a random terrorist hijacking was in fact a carefully orchestrated revenge operation. And Thomas realized with growing horror that he hadn't just thwarted a crime, he had inadvertently exposed himself to enemies who had spent decades hunting the man who destroyed their family's criminal empire. The backpack Dmitry carried didn't contain conventional explosives, but something far more terrifying. A dirty radiological device capable of contaminating thousands of square miles, turning Denver into a dead zone for generations. The airport terrorists had been nothing more than a distraction. The true threat had slipped away in the chaos and was now free to carry out the plan. Thomas knew he had only hours before Dmitry found a suitable location to detonate the bomb, likely during peak hours, when the city was most crowded and the contamination would have maximum impact. Federal authorities were wasting precious time trying to identify him through official channels, following bureaucratic protocols, while a weapon of mass destruction roamed freely in the city. Every passing minute exponentially increased the number of lives at risk, and Thomas knew he was the only living person who understood Volkov's operational patterns well enough to anticipate them. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. The very act of heroism that forced him out of the shadows now demanded he use his exposed identity to stop a catastrophe that could kill hundreds of thousands of innocent people. Thomas tracked Dmitry Volkov to the rooftop of the tallest building in Denver, where the wind would carry radioactive particles across the metropolitan area once the dirty bomb was detonated. The final confrontation between the veteran spy and the son of the man he had once eliminated unfolded against the backdrop of the sunset over the Rocky Mountains. Two lives shattered by violence, facing off in a duel that would decide the fate of millions. Dmitry, consumed by decades of hatred, drew a combat knife the moment he sensed Thomas behind him. The young Russian turned like a wounded predator, eyes burning with vengeance. "At last," he growled. "Time for you to pay for what you did to my father." Thomas tried to maintain distance, but Dmitry was younger, faster, fueled by years of concentrated rage. They fought brutally on the cold concrete of the rooftop, fists and kicks echoing against the mountain wind. Thomas dodged the first slash of the blade, but on the second, he felt cold steel pierce his abdomen, slicing through muscle and organs. The pain was searing, but adrenaline and decades of training kept Thomas conscious. In a desperate move, he grabbed Dmitry's wrist, twisted until he heard bones snap, and delivered a flurry of precise strikes that left the younger man unconscious on the ground. With blood pouring between his fingers, Thomas staggered toward the radiological device. The timer showed 43 seconds. His hands trembled, but his training prevailed. He cut the correct wires, disconnected the circuits in the precise sequence, and silenced the countdown with only 7 seconds remaining. Denver was safe. Thomas fell to his knees, the knife wound finally taking its toll. Blood pooled around him as his vision began to fade. In his final moments, he thought of Sarah, the life they could have had together, the millions of people who would never know they were alive because of an invisible man. 15 minutes later, an FBI helicopter landed on the rooftop. Agents found Dmitry Volkov still unconscious, handcuffed him and dragged him away while paramedics knelt beside Thomas's lifeless body. One agent found a folded note in the inner pocket of the dead man's coat, detailed instructions on how to dismantle the entire criminal network Dmitry had built. The next day's headlines spoke of a successful federal operation that had thwarted a terrorist attack. Thomas Morrison's name was never mentioned. His true identity was buried with him, and the world kept spinning, unaware that it owed its safety to a ghost who had finally found peace.